The morning mist clings to the ancient stones like memory itself, refusing to release its hold even as the first rays of sunlight pierce through the dense canopy overhead. Walking through these temple grounds feels less like moving through space and more like traversing the boundaries between centuries, where each footstep echoes with the prayers and proclamations of civilizations that once commanded these lands with absolute authority. The air hangs heavy with moisture and the scent of earth, that peculiar fragrance that emerges when stone and soil have known each other for nearly a millennium. Angkor Wat rises from the jungle floor with a presence that defies simple description. It isn't merely large, though its dimensions certainly overwhelm the senses. The temple complex stretches across more than 400 acres, a sprawling testament to human ambition and devotion that continues to hold the title of the world's largest religious monument. But statistics can't capture the visceral response that occurs when you first glimpse those 5 lotus bud towers breaking the horizon, their silhouettes rendered in perfect symmetry against the changing sky. The structure was conceived in the 12th century by King Suryavarman II as a dedication to the Hindu god Vishnu, though the spiritual currents that flow through these corridors have shifted over time, adopting Buddhist practices while retaining the architectural vocabulary of its original purpose. The approach to Angkor Wat requires crossing a wide moat, its surface reflecting the temple towers with such clarity that reality seems doubled, multiplied. As though the builders intended to create not just a monument but a meditation on duality itself. The causeway stretches nearly 200 meters, elevated just enough above the water that you can hear the gentle lapping against the stone retaining walls. Nagas, those serpentine creatures from Hindu and Buddhist mythology, line the balustrades with their multiple heads fanned out in eternal vigilance. Their scales were carved with such precision that even now, weathered by centuries of monsoon rains and scorching dry seasons, the individual segments remain visible, each one a small declaration of the artisan's patience. The outer gallery walls present a narrative carved in stone that rivals any written epic for complexity and drama. These bas-reliefs extend for hundreds of meters, depicting scenes from the great Hindu texts, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, along with historical events from the reign of Suryavarman II himself. The famous churning of the Sea of Milk shows gods and demons working in concert, pulling on the body of the serpent Vasuki to churn the cosmic ocean and produce the elixir of immortality. The figures seem to strain with the effort, their carved muscles tense, their expressions fixed in eternal exertion. Standing before these walls, you can trace the stories panel by panel, watching armies clash in the Battle of Kurukshetra, where warriors ride elephants in chariots, where arrows fly in stone trajectories that will never land. What strikes you most forcefully isn't the grandeur alone, but the obsessive attention to detail. Every surface that could be carved has been carved. Apsaras, those celestial dancers, don't appear in hundreds of variations throughout the temple, no two exactly alike. They stand in graceful contrapposto, one hip jutted slightly, their elaborate headdresses rising in tiers of floral and geometric patterns. Their jewelry was rendered with such care that you can distinguish individual strands of beads, the clasps of bracelets, the delicate chains that drape across their bodies. Some smile with subtle, enigmatic expressions, others gaze outward with serene detachment. The anonymous sculptors who created them must have worked for years, decades even, chipping away at the sandstone block by block, following designs that may have been sketched out by master planners, but were ultimately realized through the accumulated effort of countless hands. The central sanctuary rises in steep terraces, each level representing another plane of existence in the cosmic geography that structured ancient Khmer understanding of the universe. Mount Meru, the center of all physical and spiritual universes, served as the template, and climbing these stairs becomes an act of ascension in more than just the literal sense. The steps are narrow and tall, designed perhaps to force pilgrims into a posture of humility, climbing on hands and feet rather than striding upward with easy confidence. From the uppermost level, the view extends across the entire complex, over the libraries and the pools, beyond the outer walls to where the jungle has reclaimed what were once bustling settlements. It's possible to imagine the temple as it might have appeared in its prime, when the towers were covered in gold leaf that caught the light like flames, or when the courtyards buzzed with priests and devotees, when the air was thick with incense smoke and the sound of chanting. But time and nature have collaborated to create something the original builders never could have anticipated. The stones have weathered to shades of gray and ochre, stained by centuries of rain and sun. Lichens paint abstract patterns across surfaces once pristine. Small plants have found purchase in cracks and crevices, their roots working slowly but inexorably to widen the gaps. This isn't decay in the tragic sense, it's transformation, the way these monuments have been absorbed into the landscape, becoming part of the living environment rather than standing apart from it. Leaving Angkor Wat behind, the journey to the Bayon takes you through forest paths where the light filters down in shifting patterns, and illuminating leaves and vines that form a green tunnel. The Bayon sits at the center of Angkor Thom, the fortified city that served as the capital of the Khmer Empire during its height. While Angkor Wat impresses through its scale and symmetry, the Bayon operates on a different register entirely. This temple seems to have grown organically from the ground, its towers clustered together without obvious geometric logic, creating a skyline that appears almost chaotic until you begin to discern the patterns underlying its construction. The faces appear gradually as you approach, revealing themselves in profile first, then turning to meet your gaze as your perspective shifts. They're everywhere, more than 200 of them carved into the 54 towers that remain standing. Each face measures several meters in height, their features rendered with a stylization that manages to be both abstract and intensely personal. The eyes are half closed in meditation, or perhaps in a smile of deep knowing. The lips curve upward at the corners, suggesting contentment or perhaps compassion. The noses are broad and flat, the earlobes elongated in the manner of Buddha images, hanging down to brush against shoulders that merge seamlessly into the stone blocks below. These faces have been identified variously as representations of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, or as portraits of King Jayavarman VII himself, who commissioned the temple in the late 12th century. The truth might encompass both interpretations, a conflation of the divine and the royal that was common in Khmer political theology. Regardless of their precise identity, so their effect is unmistakable. They watch from every direction, serene and omnipresent. You can't escape their gaze, can't find an angle where you're not being observed by those calm, knowing expressions. It creates an atmosphere that's simultaneously comforting and unsettling, a reminder that in this place, the boundaries between the sacred and the secular were never clearly drawn. The bas-reliefs at the Bayon tell different stories than those at Angkor Wat. Here, alongside the mythological scenes, are depictions of everyday life in the Khmer Empire. You can see fishermen casting nets, women selling goods at market, people cooking over open fires, soldiers preparing for battle. These images provide an invaluable record of how ordinary people lived, what they wore, what tools they used. There are scenes of Chinese traders arriving by boat, their distinctive hats identifying them as foreigners. There are images of cockfights and chess games, of women giving birth and children playing. The carvers captured moments with an immediacy that makes them feel contemporary, as though these events happened yesterday rather than 8 centuries ago. Walking through the narrow corridors of the Bayon, you become aware of how the architecture creates specific experiences of space and light. The passages are deliberately constricted, forcing you to move slowly, to turn corners without knowing what lies ahead. Then suddenly you emerge into a courtyard where the sky opens above, and the stone faces look down from their towers, and the contrast between confinement and release becomes charged with meaning. Light and shadow play across the carved surfaces, changing their expressions, making the stone seem almost animate. In the early morning or late afternoon, when the sun strikes at oblique angles, the faces seem to emerge from the towers themselves, as though the stone is revealing something that was always present but only becomes visible under specific conditions. The central tower rises above the others, its faces oriented toward the cardinal directions, maintaining watch over all approaches. Climbing the narrow steps to reach this level requires navigating through passages that feel more like caves than corridors, where the weight of the stone presses down from above and the walls lean inward. At the top, the perspective shifts entirely. You're surrounded by the faces now, at eye level with their serene gazes. And the city spreads out below in all directions. The other towers of the Bayon rise around you like a congregation of silent witnesses, their faces turned inward as though participating in an eternal assembly. Evidence of the temple's original decoration remains in traces. Here and there you can spot remnants of the stucco that once covered much of the carved work, and in protected corners, hints of the gilding that would have made the entire structure gleam like a jeweled crown. The stones would have been painted as well, the bas-reliefs picked out in bright colors that made the narratives easier to read from a distance. It's difficult now to imagine the Bayon in such vivid array, so thoroughly has the weathered gray stone come to define our understanding of these monuments. The current state feels somehow more appropriate, more honest, as though the architecture has been refined down to its essential nature through the process of aging. Moving beyond the most famous temples, deeper into the archaeological park, you encounter structures that remain partially consumed by the forest, where the relationship between human construction and natural reclamation becomes even more pronounced. Ta Prohm has become perhaps the most photographed example of this phenomenon. Its galleries and chambers penetrated by the roots of massive silk cotton and strangler fig trees. The roots flow over walls like water frozen mid-cascade, gray and sinuous, splitting stones apart with slow, relentless pressure while simultaneously holding the fragmenting structures together. It's impossible to determine anymore whether the trees are destroying the temple or preserving it, whether their removal would allow for proper restoration or cause the entire complex to collapse. The decision to leave Ta Prohm in this state was deliberate, a recognition that the trees have become as much a part of the monument as the stones themselves. Walking through its corridors, you navigate around roots that have grown to the diameter of tree trunks in their own right, their surfaces smooth and pale where countless visitors have touched them in passing. The galleries are darker here, the canopy overhead blocking much of the sunlight, and the air feels cool and damp even at midday. Moss grows thick on the stones, and small ferns sprout from cracks in the walls. The sound of your footsteps changes depending on whether you're walking on stone, earth, or root, creating a subtle percussion that emphasizes your passage through these spaces. The carvings at Ta Prohm are similar in style to those at Angkor Wat, dating from approximately the same period, but their condition is more varied. In protected areas, the details remain sharp, the apsaras still dancing with their characteristic grace. But where exposure to the elements or the intrusion of roots has taken its toll, the figures have been softened, their features worn smooth, becoming abstract suggestions of their original forms. There's something poignant about these eroded carvings, the way they document the passage of time more eloquently than any pristine preservation could. They remind you that nothing, no matter how carefully crafted or how massive its construction, remains unchanged. Everything flows, everything transforms, and the marks we make upon the world are subject to forces far greater than our ability to control them. Yet further into the forest, accessible only by rougher paths, sits Ta Som, a smaller temple complex that sees fewer visitors despite offering its own particular enchantments. The entrance towers here are also penetrated by fig trees, their roots spreading across the carved facades like the fingers of giants. The central sanctuary is compact, its carved decorations less elaborate than the major temples, but no less carefully executed. What Ta Som offers is a sense of discovery, the feeling that you're finding something that hasn't been found before, even though guides have been leading tourists to this spot for decades. The path from Ta Som leads deeper into the forest, where the canopy grows thicker and the light filters through in scattered patches. Here the jungle asserts itself more aggressively, and the temples feel less like historical monuments and more like secrets being kept by the earth itself. The French archaeologists who began studying these sites in the late 19th century faced an enormous challenge, having to distinguish between what should be preserved as found and what should be restored to a semblance of its original form. These decisions continue to shape how visitors experience the temples today, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the ongoing debate about preservation versus presentation. Walking through these sites, you begin to understand that the temples were never meant to be static. Even in their heyday, they were constantly being modified, expanded, and reimagined by successive rulers. Each king wanted to leave his mark to demonstrate his devotion and power through architecture. The result is a complex layering of styles and periods, sometimes harmonious and sometimes contradictory. You can see where one ruler's vision was interrupted by death or defeat, leaving projects incomplete or hastily finished by less ambitious successors. You can trace the evolution of artistic styles in the increasingly elaborate apsara figures, the dancing celestial nymphs that adorn so many walls. Early examples are relatively simple, their poses constrained and their expressions serene. Later versions display more dynamic movement, more detailed jewelry, more individualized features. Some archaeologists have identified specific apsaras that appear to be portraits of actual court dancers, and their distinctive facial features preserved in stone. The religious transition from Hinduism to Buddhism in the late 12th and 13th centuries left its mark throughout the complex. Jayavarman VII, the king who built the Bayon and many other temples, was a devout Mahayana Buddhist who undertook an ambitious building campaign that transformed the religious landscape. Earlier Hindu temples were often modified to accommodate Buddhist worship, with images of the Buddha added to Hindu shrines or Hindu deities reinterpreted in Buddhist contexts. This religious flexibility speaks to something essential about Khmer culture at its height, a willingness to embrace multiple spiritual traditions without seeing them as contradictory. The gods of the Hindu pantheon weren't rejected, but rather incorporated into a broader cosmic vision that included the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas. Standing in front of a wall where Hindu and Buddhist imagery coexist, you can sense the theological conversations that must have taken place in the courts and monasteries. These weren't simple conversions or conquests of one belief system by another, but rather complex processes of synthesis and reinterpretation. The preservation of earlier Hindu art in Buddhist temples suggests a respect for tradition even as new spiritual directions were being explored. It also reflects practical considerations. The enormous cost and labor required to completely remake these massive structures meant that adaptation was often more feasible than demolition and reconstruction. The smaller temples scattered around the main complex offer intimate encounters with this history. Banteay Khday, a sprawling monastery temple, has walls that seem to lean in toward each other, creating narrow corridors where the stones press close. The architecture here is less refined than at Angkor Wat, the carving less precise, suggesting it was built quickly or with limited resources. Yet it possesses a certain rough authenticity, a sense that human hands shaped these stones without the rigid oversight that characterized the royal projects. Buddhist monks lived and studied here for centuries, their daily rituals sanctifying spaces that now stand empty except for occasional visitors and the small geckos that dart across the walls. Preah Khan, another of Jayavarman VII's creations, occupies a vast area north of Angkor Thom. Its name means sacred sword, and legend says it was built on the site of a military victory. The temple served multiple functions, including religious, administrative, and educational roles. Walking through its extensive galleries, you pass through areas that once housed thousands of dancers, teachers, and attendants. The walls here tell stories in stone, long narrative sequences depicting battles and ceremonies, daily life and divine intervention. In one section, trees have grown through the buildings in such a way that their roots form natural archways, replacing the stone vaults that have collapsed. These organic arches are surprisingly sturdy, having developed over decades into load-bearing structures that actually help support the surrounding masonry. The Hall of Dancers at Preah Khan displays some of the most beautiful apsara carvings in the entire complex. These celestial beings were believed to dance for the gods in heaven, and their earthly representations were meant to bring that divine beauty into the human realm. The sculptors who created them paid extraordinary attention to detail, carving the individual pleats of their skirts, the links of their necklaces, the flowers in their headdresses. Each hand gesture carries meaning, part of a complex vocabulary of symbolic poses that would have been instantly readable to the temple's original audience. Modern visitors can still appreciate the grace and elegance of these figures, even without understanding the specific meanings their poses conveyed. Beyond the major temple complexes, smaller shrines and ruins dot the landscape for miles in every direction. Many have never been fully excavated or restored, remaining as little more than piles of carved stones surrounded by forest. Finding these forgotten places requires a willingness to venture off the established tourist routes, to follow muddy paths that may or may not lead anywhere. The rewards for such exploration can be considerable. You might find a tiny shrine with perfectly preserved lintels, its doorway framing nothing but jungle. You might discover a pond where locals still come to make offerings, placing incense and flowers before a weathered statue whose features have been worn smooth by centuries of rain. These encounters feel more authentic somehow, less mediated by tourism infrastructure and historical interpretation. The question of authenticity haunts these sites. What we see today is simultaneously ancient and modern, genuine and reconstructed. The Angkor Archaeological Park is a carefully managed creation, the result of decisions made by colonial archaeologists, Cambodian officials, and international preservation organizations. The temples themselves are real, but the experience of visiting them has been shaped by contemporary concerns about access, safety, and education. Walkways have been built, signs erected, viewing platforms constructed. These interventions are necessary to protect both the monuments and their visitors, but they also create a distance between the viewer and the viewed, a reminder that we're tourists observing rather than participants experiencing. Photography has become the primary way most visitors engage with the temples. Everywhere you look, people are framing shots, seeking the perfect angle to capture the play of light on stone or the dramatic contrast between carved face and surrounding foliage. This creates a curious doubled awareness, seeing the temple both directly and through the potential photograph. The most popular viewpoints have become staging areas where visitors wait their turn to stand in the optimal position, reproducing images they've seen in guidebooks and on social media. There's something both understandable and slightly sad about this, the way the pursuit of the perfect image can interfere with direct experience. Yet those photographs also serve a purpose, carrying images of these extraordinary places into homes and offices around the world, and potentially inspiring future visits, or simply expanding awareness of this remarkable cultural heritage. The sunset viewing at Phnom Bakheng, a temple built on a natural hill, has become almost comically overcrowded, with hundreds of people jostling for position on the upper terraces. The actual sunset views can be disappointing, as the main temples lie in directions that don't align with the setting sun. But the ritual of gathering there persists, driven by guidebook recommendations and hotel concierge advice. The experience says something about how tourism shapes and sometimes distorts cultural heritage sites, creating expected experiences that may bear little relationship to the original purpose or significance of a place. Those who arrive at Phnom Bakheng in the morning or midday find a very different temple, quieter and more contemplative, its terraces offering expansive views of the forest canopy stretching toward the horizon. Water management was central to Angkor's success and eventual decline. The massive Baray reservoirs that supplied water for agriculture and urban use were engineering marvels, carefully calibrated to capture monsoon rains and release them gradually through the dry season. The western Baray, still partly filled with water today, measures over 8 kilometers long and more than 2 kilometers wide. Standing on its banks, you can barely see the far shore. Imagine the labor required to excavate this by hand, moving millions of cubic meters of earth without modern machinery. The system of canals and dikes that distributed water from these reservoirs throughout the urban area was equally impressive. A hydraulic network that sustained a population estimated at close to 1 million people at the empire's height. Recent research using satellite imagery and LiDAR technology has revealed that the extent of Angkor was far greater than previously understood. What appeared from the ground to be natural hills and depressions are actually artificial mounds and engineered water features, evidence of a vast urban landscape that extended for hundreds of square kilometers. This discovery has fundamentally changed how scholars understand the city's organization and the relationship between urban and rural areas. Rather than a concentrated city surrounded by rice fields, Angkor appears to have been more dispersed, with residential areas, temples, and agricultural land interwoven in complex patterns. The temples we visit today were the ceremonial and religious centers of this sprawling metropolis, the most permanent manifestations of a civilization that also built extensively in wood and other perishable materials. The fate of those wooden buildings remains unknown except through stone carvings that depict them. We can see representations of houses on stilts, public buildings with elaborate peaked roofs, markets and workshops. These images provide tantalizing glimpses of daily life in ancient Angkor, showing activities and structures that have otherwise vanished completely. The disparity between what has survived and what has been lost is sobering. For every stone temple still standing, dozens or hundreds of wooden structures have rotted away, taking with them countless details about how people actually lived. What remains is the official monumental architecture, the buildings meant to last forever and project power and piety across the centuries. The inscriptions that cover many temple walls and doorways provide another window into the past, though one that requires specialized knowledge to open. These texts, written in Sanskrit and Khmer, record dedications, religious formulas, historical events, and administrative details. Reading them is like hearing voices from 1,000 years ago, even if those voices speak in the formal language of royal proclamation and religious observance. Some inscriptions list the extensive staffs required to maintain the temples, naming specific positions from high priests to dancers to gardeners. Others describe the donations of land and resources that supported temple operations, revealing the economic systems that underpinned religious practice. A few contain more personal notes, prayers, or pledges that offer glimpses of individual faith and hope. One recurring theme in these inscriptions is the merit acquired through building and supporting temples. This concept, deeply rooted in Buddhist thought but also present in Hinduism, held that pious actions generated spiritual credit that would lead to better rebirths and eventually to liberation from the cycle of rebirth. Kings built temples partly from genuine devotion, but also to accumulate the merit that would ensure their posthumous glorification and eventual enlightenment. The grandeur of Angkor Wat reflects not just Suryavarman II's power, but his anxiety about his spiritual state. His determination to secure his place in the cosmic order through the most elaborate offering possible. The collapse of the Angkorian Empire remains somewhat mysterious, though scholars have proposed various contributing factors. Environmental degradation, particularly the failure of the water management system, likely played a significant role. Centuries of intensive agriculture may have depleted the soil, while deforestation for temple construction and fuel would have increased erosion and disrupted the hydrological balance. The system that had sustained the city's growth may have become overstrained, unable to adapt to climate variations or recover from major disruptions. Our recent paleoclimate research suggests that a series of severe droughts alternating with destructive floods in the 14th and 15th centuries may have delivered fatal blows to the agricultural infrastructure. Military pressure from the Thai kingdoms to the west also contributed to Angkor's decline. Repeated invasions weakened the empire and eventually led to the abandonment of the capital. The shift of the Khmer capital to Phnom Penh, closer to the Mekong River and trade routes to the sea, reflected changing economic priorities and political realities. Angkor didn't disappear overnight, but gradually faded as resources and population moved elsewhere. The temples were never entirely abandoned. Buddhist monks continued to occupy Angkor Wat and some other sites, maintaining a presence even as the jungle reclaimed surrounding buildings. Local villagers kept knowledge of the ruins alive, even if they didn't fully understand the history behind them. When European explorers and missionaries began visiting Angkor in the 16th and 17th centuries, they were astonished by what they found. Their accounts describe vast ruins swallowed by jungle, mysterious inscriptions in unknown scripts, architecture unlike anything in their experience. Some couldn't believe that Asian civilizations had created such sophisticated buildings and proposed ridiculous theories about Romans or Alexander the Great having built them. These colonial prejudices slowly gave way to more accurate understandings as scholars learned to read the inscriptions and study the architectural evidence. The establishment of French colonial control over Cambodia in the late 19th century brought systematic archaeological investigation to Angkor, though it also reflected and reinforced colonial power dynamics that are still being reckoned with today. The French École Française d'Extrême Orient took on the enormous task of mapping, studying, and preserving Angkor. Their work, whatever its colonial context, laid the foundation for all subsequent research and preservation efforts. They cleared vegetation, documented buildings, attempted reconstructions, and created the first comprehensive maps of the site. They also removed countless artifacts to museums in Phnom Penh and Paris, a practice that would be considered cultural theft today, but was standard colonial behavior at the time. Many of the most important discoveries about Angkor's history and culture emerged from this French scholarship, even as it served French imperial interests. The 20th century brought new challenges to Angkor. The wars that devastated Cambodia, culminating in the genocidal Khmer Rouge regime, left the temples damaged and neglected. Landmines were planted throughout the complex. Looters removed statues and architectural elements to sell on the international art market. When peace finally returned in the 1990s, the condition of the temples had deteriorated significantly. The international community rallied to support preservation efforts, and with teams from Japan, India, Germany, China, and other countries taking responsibility for specific temples, this cooperation has been generally successful, though it has also created a patchwork of different restoration philosophies and techniques that sometimes clash. Walking through a temple where Japanese conservators are working, you see their meticulous approach, carefully documenting every stone before dismantling unstable structures and rebuilding them with modern engineering hidden beneath traditional exteriors. Indian teams have taken different approaches, often allowing more vegetation to remain while stabilizing the most critical structural elements. These varying methods reflect different cultural attitudes toward conservation and different interpretations of what authenticity means for these ancient sites. There's no single right answer, only different choices about what to prioritize and preserve. The tension between tourism and preservation remains acute. The temples need tourism revenue to support conservation work and provide economic benefits to local communities. But too many visitors cause damage through wear and erosion, while the infrastructure required to support them impacts the landscape and archaeology. Finding the right balance is an ongoing challenge, one that requires constant adjustment as visitor numbers fluctuate and new threats emerge. Climate change poses particularly serious concerns, with changing rainfall patterns and more severe storms threatening structures already weakened by centuries of exposure. Despite these challenges, the temples endure. Stone resists time in ways that other materials cannot, and the sheer mass of these constructions provides inherent stability. The integration with nature that makes them so visually striking also, paradoxically, helps preserve them. Tree roots can damage walls, but they also hold structures together, preventing collapse. Vegetation protects stones from direct sunlight and rain. The forest provides a microclimate that moderates temperature swings and reduces erosion. This doesn't mean preservation isn't necessary, but it suggests that working with nature rather than against it may offer the most sustainable approach. On your final morning at Angkor, you might find yourself back at Angkor Wat, seeing it differently now after days of exploring other temples. The details you missed on first viewing become apparent, the subtle variations in carving style, as the evidence of repairs and modifications over centuries, the way different sections catch the light. You understand better how this single temple relates to the larger complex, how it represents the culmination of Khmer architectural achievement, even as it incorporated elements from earlier structures. You see it not as an isolated monument, but as part of a cultural and spiritual landscape that stretched across the empire. The experience of visiting these temples changes you in ways both obvious and subtle. The immediate impact is visual and emotional, the awe inspired by such overwhelming artistic and engineering accomplishment. But there's also a deeper effect, a recalibration of your sense of history and human possibility. These buildings were created by civilizations about which most people know little, yet their sophistication rivals anything produced in Europe or elsewhere at the same time. They stand as evidence that human creativity and determination can produce works that outlast empires and speak across centuries to people who share neither language nor culture with their creators. Walking out through the western gate of Angkor Wat as afternoon light slants across the causeway, you carry with you images and impressions that will continue to unfold in memory. The stone faces of the Bayon smiling enigmatically, the silk cotton tree embracing Ta Prohm's gallery, the endless narrative reliefs telling stories you only partially understood, the quiet corners where you stood alone for a moment surrounded by ancient stones. These memories become part of your internal landscape, reference points for thinking about time and impermanence, ambition and devotion, destruction and survival. The temples will remain long after your visit, continuing their slow negotiation with nature and time. Other visitors will walk the same paths, photograph the same views, wonder at the same mysteries. Conservators will continue their patient work, clearing drains, reinforcing foundations, monitoring for new damage. Local communities will maintain their complex relationships with these sites, sources of pride and income, but also constant reminders of a past that feels both connected and distant. The forests will keep growing, roots questing through stone joints, seeking any weakness to exploit. The rains will fall and the sun will beat down, each season adding its small increments of erosion and decay. Yet through all this, the essential character of the temples persists. The vision that drove their creation, that drive to capture the cosmic order in earthly form, remains legible in their proportions and decorations. The spiritual power they were meant to embody and transmit still radiates from them, moving even visitors who come seeking nothing more than interesting architecture and good photographs. Something in these stones speaks to something in us, bridging the vast gap of centuries and culture through the universal human impulses toward beauty, meaning, and transcendence. The ancient builders could not have imagined how their world would change, how their civilization would fall and their temples would be reclaimed by jungle, only to be rediscovered and celebrated by people from across the globe. But perhaps they understood that creating something truly exceptional meant creating something that could outlast their own time and context, something that would continue speaking long after the specific messages and meanings they intended had faded into scholarly speculation. Standing in the shadow of these extraordinary structures, you become part of a continuum of human response to them that stretches back to their creation and forward into an unknowable future. Your presence there, however brief, connects you to everyone else who has ever looked up at those towers and felt wonder, from the workers who built them to the monks who prayed in them to the French archaeologists who studied them to the countless visitors who have come and will come. The temples don't need your admiration to continue existing, but they fulfill their deepest purpose when they evoke that response, when they make people stop and look and think about something beyond the immediate concerns of daily life. In that sense, despite all that has changed and been lost, despite the passage of centuries and the transformation of the surrounding culture, the temples of Angkor continue doing what they were always meant to do, directing attention toward questions of meaning and permanence that transcend any single era or civilization.